He was born into bondage, but refused to be defined by it. A man of unbreakable spirit, unshakable conviction, and a voice that would not be silenced. Fredrick Douglass rose from the depths of slavery to become one of the most powerful and influential figures in American history. A masterful orator, a fearless abolitionist, and a visionary statesman, Douglass's words echoed far beyond the borders of the United States, reaching across the Atlantic to Europe, where he was embraced with great reverence. His speeches ignited change, his writings challenged the conscience of a nation, and his legacy endures as a beacon of justice and equality. This is the story of a man who defied the odds, reshaped history, and became one of the most progressive voices of his time. Born into the shackles of slavery on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey entered a world of bondage, oppression, and uncertainty. His birthplace was likely his grandmother's humble cabin. The exact date of his birth was unknown to him. He wrote that he was born in 1817, however. Documents unearthed by historians in later years show that he was born in 1818. Frederick's mother, Harriet Bailey, was a slave, while his father, likely his enslaver, was of European descent. In his writings, Douglass reflected on the cruel reality that his father was a white man, though he would spend his life searching in vain for his true identity. In the cruel tradition of slavery, Frederick and his mother were separated while he was still an infant. She worked on a neighboring plantation and had to walk 12 miles to see her son. He only saw her a handful of times, and almost always at night. She died when he was 7 years old. In a twist of fate, 8-year-old Frederick was sent by his owner, Thomas Auld, to live with his brother, Hugh Auld, in Baltimore. Frederick's role was to take care of the young son of Hugh and Sophie Auld. He soon learned that being a slave in the city was different from being a plantation slave. City life offered him a new experience. It was here that an unexpected gift changed his world forever. Sophia Auld, a kind-hearted woman who was unaware of the dangerous power of knowledge, began teaching Frederick how to read. But when her husband discovered this, he was furious. Literacy, he believed, was not for the enslaved. He knew that a slave who could read would encounter abolitionist material which would inspire them toward rebellion. To young Frederick, this was his first great lesson. He learnt that education was the key to freedom. Determined to continue learning, Frederick began teaching himself to read and write in secret. He sought knowledge wherever he could, from discarded newspapers to scraps of paper on the street. One book in particular, The Columbian Orator, deeply shaped his views on human rights and freedom. He traded food for knowledge, giving poor white boys food in exchange for them to teach him new words. Frederick Bailey, the young boy who was once forced to sleep on a dirt floor, would soon escape his chains. Now that he was exposed to city life and gained the ability to read and write, he had his first real taste for freedom. In the year 1833, the young Frederick Bailey, now aged 16, was taken from the relative stability of Hugh Auld's household and sent back to his owner, Thomas Auld. But Frederick was now literate, and having lived in relative freedom, couldn't settle into plantation life. He was defiant and maybe even full of youthful arrogance. His owner didn't know how to make the young man yield, and it was at this point that Thomas leased Frederick to Edward Covey. Covey's name struck fear in the hearts of the enslaved. He was known as the slave breaker, a man who ruled with a whip and sought to shatter both body and soul. For months, Frederick endured torment. Covey repeatedly beat him, but something deep within him refused to break. At just 16, he had reached his limit. In a moment of defiance, he fought back, grappling with Covey for 2 hours in a desperate struggle for dignity. When the dust settled, Fredrick stood victorious, and from that day forward, Covey never laid a hand on him again. This moment, this act of defiance, was more than a fight. It was a transformation. The boy who had been treated as less than human now saw himself as a man who would no longer accept bondage. Fredrick's desire for freedom burned brighter than ever. While working on William Freeland's farm, he attempted his first escape but failed, and he was sent back to Baltimore. In 1837, he met and fell in love with Anna Murray, a free black woman in Baltimore. Their love was more than romance. It was a shared vision of liberty. Anna saw in him the promise of a remarkable future and provided him with the financial resources and courage to make another attempt at freedom. On September 3, 1838, with the help of identification papers obtained from a free black seaman, Fredrick boarded a northbound train. At that time, black sailors were protected under the American flag and given documents allowing them to travel. As he traveled, Douglass's heart pounded with anticipation. Every mile was a step toward freedom, a step away from bondage. After a perilous journey spanning less than 24 hours, Fredrick arrived in New York City in a homeless, houseless, and helpless condition, as he later recounted in his first autobiography. He sent word to Anna, who quickly joined him. The two were married on September 15, 1838. Fredrick and his wife, Anna Murray, moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, a thriving center of abolitionism, filled with formerly enslaved people determined to forge new lives. They were welcomed into the home of Nathan and Mary Johnson, who provided them with more than just shelter. Here, Fredrick adopted the surname that would become legendary. Having been known as Frederick Bailey, and briefly as Frederick Stanley and Frederick Johnson, he now became Fredrick Douglass, a name inspired by a character in Sir Walter Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake, which is about an exiled nobleman. Fredrick Douglass was a very spiritual man. Now that he was settled in New Bedford, he had hopes of joining the Methodist Church, but he was disheartened by its segregation. Instead, he found his place in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. It was here that Douglass honed his skills as an orator. His voice, once silenced in bondage, now carried the weight of justice. In 1841, at just 23 years old, Douglass delivered his first major speech at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society's convention in Nantucket. The crowd was captivated. His eloquence and first-hand account of slavery's horrors would make him one of the most powerful speakers of the abolitionist movement. Douglass's words reached the ears of renowned abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. The two formed a deep connection, with Garrison's weekly paper, The Liberator, profoundly shaping Douglass's abolitionist ideology. Their partnership propelled Douglass into the heart of the movement, though it would later fracture as his beliefs evolved. Douglass was a subscriber to William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, a publication that deeply impressed him for its anti-slavery sentiments. Garrison likewise held Douglass in high regard. Both men cultivated a friendship centered on similar ideals and convictions. However, as Douglass's vision evolved, so did his stance. Initially, he echoed Garrison's belief that the U.S. Constitution was a pro-slavery document and that moral suasion would lead people to end slavery. At first, Douglass agreed, but he soon came to realize that no matter how much he spoke about the horrors of slavery, people wouldn't end it on their own. He came to believe that a legal document such as the Constitution could be wielded as a weapon against slavery. This ideological shift caused a permanent rift between Douglass and Garrison. In 1845, Douglass published his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Fredrick Douglass, an American Slave. It was a groundbreaking work that both laid bare the atrocities of slavery and helped to prove that Douglass was, in truth, a runaway slave. Prior to its publication, some accused Douglass of lying about a life in slavery. They said his ability to read and write, his eloquence, and his dignified stature were not that of a former slave. But Douglass was able to describe places and people, even going so far as to name his owner. The book became an instant bestseller, yet its success placed him in peril. His former enslaver could still legally reclaim him. Fearing capture, Douglass set sail for the UK, where he travelled and lectured. Douglass gained many British supporters who recognized the important role he had to play in the fight against slavery. They raised funds on his behalf and were able to purchase his freedom for a price of $711.66. This support allowed him to return to the United States in 1847 as a free man with enough money to start his own newspaper. The North Star, an abolitionist newspaper, became a beacon of anti-slavery resistance. In 1848, a groundbreaking event took place in Seneca Falls, one that would ignite a movement and change the course of history forever. The Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's rights convention in the United States, and it marked the beginning of an organized struggle for gender equality. The convention sought to address the inequalities women face daily, from lack of voting rights to legal and economic restrictions. One voice stood out that day, not just for its eloquence, but for its unique perspective. Fredrick Douglass, he was the only black attendee at the convention and took a stand for women's suffrage when others hesitated. His argument was clear. He could not accept the right to vote as a black man if women were denied the same right. Beyond Seneca Falls, Douglass used his newspaper, the North Star, to champion women's rights. He wrote with conviction, condemning those who dismissed the movement. Despite his support for women's rights, a rift soon developed between Douglass and the women in the movement. The 15th Amendment, which granted black men the right to vote, was fiercely debated. Women's rights leaders like Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony felt betrayed, believing the moment should be seized for universal suffrage. Douglass, however, argued that the amendment was a critical, immediate step. He believed that black men needed the vote urgently due to their disenfranchisement and violent oppression. Stanton, on the other hand, feared that prioritizing one group over another would delay women's rights for generations. The split was deep and personal. Though Douglass and Stanton disagreed, their fight for equality laid the groundwork for future generations. Women's suffrage was ultimately achieved with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, more than 70 years after Seneca Falls. In 1848, Douglass met John Brown. The two men developed a close friendship that almost cost Douglass everything he had worked so hard to accomplish. John Brown believed that armed resistance was the wake-up call that was needed to liberate slaves. In 1859, he shared with Douglass a plan to raid the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry. He invited Douglass to participate in the raid. Brown hoped the raid would inspire a massive uprising by enslaved people, but Douglass declined the invitation. He knew it was a doomed mission, and that an attack on Harper's Ferry was an attack on the government. Brown was disappointed with Douglass's refusal to join, but went ahead anyway, as Douglass had thought the mission failed and Brown was arrested. Shortly after the raid, Douglass received word that the authorities were seeking to arrest him as an accomplice in the raid. This was based on letters from Douglass found on John Brown at the time of his arrest. Douglass once again fled the country. At first, he went to Canada, but fearing extradition, he left Canada for Europe. But when word reached Douglass that his youngest daughter Annie had died, he returned home in April 1860. Annie was only 10 years old. Though widely respected, Douglass faced significant barriers. At one time, he was seriously considered for a seat in Congress, an unthinkable notion to many. His friend and supporter, Gerrit Smith, ultimately advised against it, warning that even the mere possibility of Douglass in Congress sent shockwaves through the political establishment. The idea of a black congressman afflicted some with convulsions and others with panic. It would take another 16 years before the first black representative would finally take office. As the Civil War erupted, Douglass knew the fight against slavery had reached its defining moment. He and his fellow abolitionists argued that African Americans must not only be freed, they must take up arms to secure their own liberation. On March 21, 1863, Douglass published a stirring call to action: Men of color to arms. His own sons, Charles and Lewis, answered that call, joining the Union cause. Yet freedom, Douglass knew, was only the beginning. True equality required full citizenship: the right to vote, the right to own land, and the right to be treated as equals under the law. He pressed President Lincoln on the treatment of black soldiers, and later confronted President Andrew Johnson on the necessity of black suffrage. Douglass understood that emancipation without political power was a hollow victory. He fought tirelessly to ensure that African Americans were not just free, but fully recognized as citizens. After Lincoln's death, Douglass continued the fight, championing the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the legal cornerstones of black freedom. This was a significant milestone, but the struggle was far from over. On April 14, 1876, Douglass attended the unveiling of the Emancipation Memorial. He delivered the keynote address, which moved the crowd to respond with thunderous applause. Yet Douglass was not entirely satisfied. He critiqued the memorial's depiction of a black man still kneeling. In a letter, he wrote, "What I want to see before I die is a monument representing the Negro, not couchant on his knees like a four-footed animal, but erect on his feet like a man." As the years passed, Douglass's struggles may have changed in nature, but they were no less important. White supremacist groups terrorized freedmen. Douglass refused to be silenced. He supported President Ulysses S. Grant's efforts to dismantle the Klan and fought against the growing wave of voter suppression laws in the South. For Fredrick Douglass, the fight for justice was never-ending. From abolition to suffrage, from Reconstruction to the dawn of Jim Crow, he remained steadfast, reminding the nation of its highest ideals. Despite setbacks, including the failure of his newspaper, Douglass remained influential. In 1877, he was appointed U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia, the first African American to hold this position. However, the prestige of the title did not always come with the responsibilities it was meant to carry. Though urged to resign due to being excluded from official duties, Douglass insisted he faced no overt racism. In late 1877, Douglass made a remarkable visit. to the deathbed of his former enslaver, Thomas Auld. In an act of grace, he reconciled with the man who had once claimed ownership over him. The meeting, controversial in some circles, was an embodiment of Douglass's belief in the power of redemption and dialogue. Douglass also purchased a house in Washington, D.C. He and his wife Anna named the property Cedar Hill. They also expanded the house from 14 to 21 rooms. A year later, Douglass was also able to purchase the adjoining lots, expanding the property to 15 acres. In 1882, Douglass suffered a deeply personal blow. His wife of 44 years, Anna Murray Douglass, died. Fredrick and Anna had weathered many storms, and together they had 5 children: Rosetta, Louis, Fredrick Jr., Charles, and Annie. Following the death of their daughter Annie, Anna wasn't the same, and toward the end of her life, she suffered a series of strokes and finally died. Anna Douglass played a crucial, yet often overlooked role in supporting her family and the abolitionist movement. To provide financial stability for her family, she worked tirelessly as a laundress and learned shoemaking, supplementing the family's income when Fredrick's earnings from his speeches were inconsistent. Beyond her financial contributions, she became actively involved in the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society. It was Anna who transformed their home into a station on the Underground Railroad, providing food and shelter to countless fugitive slaves seeking freedom in Canada. Despite her immense contributions, Anna Douglass received little recognition in her husband's 3 autobiographies. As Douglass's prominence grew, his long absences and her discomfort in elite social circles created a rift between them, a stark contrast to their earlier closeness. Anna never learnt how to read and write, and though she could manage the household finances very well, she was functionally illiterate. This must have caused feelings of inferiority in her, especially knowing the educated women that her husband spent much time with, notably Julia Griffiths and Ottilie Assing. It was reported that Douglass may have had illicit affairs with these women, but there was never any evidence to prove such. Still, Anna remained steadfast in supporting Douglass's public mission. Their daughter Rosetta later reminded the world that Fredrick Douglass's legacy was made possible by Anna Murray's unwavering loyalty. Not long after her death, Douglass wrote that she was the post in the center of my house. 2 years after the death of his first wife Anna, Douglass married Helen Pitts, a white suffragist and abolitionist from New York who was nearly 20 years his junior. Over the years, Fredrick Douglass remained a key figure in American politics. In 1889, at the age of 71, President Benjamin Harrison appointed Douglass as Minister Resident and Consul General to Haiti. However, when he realized the administration's true intention was to exploit Haitian land, he resigned, unwilling to be complicit in imperialist ambitions. On February 20th, 1895, Douglass attended a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington, D.C. He was received with a standing ovation. This was to be his last. Later that evening, he collapsed and passed away. He was 77 years old. His funeral drew thousands, from U.S. senators to Supreme Court justices, all paying tribute to a man whose voice had changed a nation. He was laid to rest in Rochester, New York, beside his first wife, Anna. This escaped slave turned abolitionist, journalist, and statesman has left a legacy etched not just in stone, but in the very fabric of history. Fredrick Douglass's life was a testament to resilience, intellect, and unyielding courage. His voice echoes through the ages, reminding us of what can be accomplished when we stand up for truth and what we know is right.